nice break with good food and the possibility also of going out for some fresh air, which is good. Remember, it is always high on the agenda of museums also to improve the well-being of visitors. So in this case, we also gave you some free time to go and stretch your legs and get some fresh air to now start again. And we start again with the next speaker. We start again with the next speaker, Henrik Zipsane, who will present to us the situation of learning in museums in the Baltic and Nordic countries. Where do we stand? Henrik is the director of the Jamtli County Museum in the Jämtland region in Sweden, and also the co-founder of the Nordic Center for Heritage Learning and Creativity. To me, Henrik is a champion of lifelong learning. I met him through lifelong learning, through projects on lifelong learning, and in fact, one of his statements in his abstract is, we see ourselves as players in the lifelong learning scene, in the lifelong learning arena. In fact, lifelong learning, again, thinking of words that come to mind when working on museum education, lifelong learning has become a keyword ever since the Lisbon strategy was launched. You might remember we are now all concentrated on the Europe 2020 strategy, but before that, once upon a time, there was the Lisbon strategy which said lifelong learning is one of the pillars for the development of the European community to make it a competitive society. And we museums or museum professionals profited from this. And in fact, many projects developed which looked at audiences, not only traditional audiences for museums as school children or schools could be, but also the wide spectrum of adults, as they say, from cradle to grave, all ages and all different kinds of adults. So lifelong learning is a very, very important component of museum education. So I leave it to Henrik to tell us where things stand in the Nordic and Baltic countries.
Well, I can say thank you for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be able to share some ideas and some thinking with you, some thoughts of what we have been working on in the NCK, the Nordic Center. What I will tell you about now, I have developed together with a colleague, Anna Hansen, who is the director, the managing director of the NCK at home in Östersund in Sweden. Is it my telephone? Okay, could be. Okay, it's better? Okay. Well, in continuation of what Margarita said, we in the museums, and I think Kalle before lunch illustrated this perfectly. Our self-image as museums are that we are learning organizations, learning institutions, providing learning for everybody. And studying museum history, I think that most of us share an image that this is how it all began. Taking care of cultural heritage and art collections and sharing these collections and the impact of using these collections in learning, fostering national identity, regional identity, or whatever. We share, all of us. Then we can see on the images that museums conduct or produce learning in all many different kinds of ways. And I think that I should say that I believe that we are very good at that. And I think that we would not exist at all if we were not as good as we are today. But we have to become better. And this is what this study is about. What we did was the following. in collaboration with the national museum organizations in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Nordic and the Baltic countries, except Iceland, but the rest of them. We conducted a survey where we asked the museums as institutions a few questions, I think it was 12 questions, about which should we say, capture their own understanding, self-understanding on their work with learning and pedagogical tasks in the museum. What are they doing and how are they doing it and what is the role of that? And we did it between 2011, we started in Sweden, and we ended up in the autumn 2014 in Denmark. And approximately 50% of the museums has answered the different questions. And what I'll show you now is not so much about differences between the countries, that's another issue. It is more the similarities, which could be interesting. A group of the questions was about what is the purpose of learning in a museum, and the colleagues, the directors, we wrote directly to the directors of each museum, could tick boxes and choose the correct one, whatever they thought was correct. And what we could see is that in the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they were very clear in choosing, should we say, a European and EU understanding of what learning is. They are used to apply for money in the European system. We know what learning is if we apply for money in the European system. We have to use the same definitions, otherwise there's no money. That is our suspicion when we read the results. But we also saw that in the Baltic countries it looked a little different. But all these three definitions, learning is the main purpose, learning is important in communication of the exhibitions, and learning is important in reaching schools, compulsory education. All three are, of course, valid, of course. We also invited the directors to answer what is learning, and they could tick boxes there. And we could see that all interaction is a very UNESCO-based European and EU used terminology, whereas the yellow one, learning takes place in special programs. That will, for many museum people today or people from the educational sector, they will say that is a very old-fashioned way a very traditional way to look at learning or pedagogical tasks today. But of course, all is valid. And what this should be seen on the background on the political development from the 70s and onwards. In the 70s, I can say that it was in 1974 in Sweden, and we see it in all the countries we have looked upon here, that during the 70s and the early 80s, the cultural policy documents from the governments put the children and young people in the front. They were the most important users or visitors to the museums. That meant also, of course, that for museums in these countries, it was very important to reach out to the compulsory school education system. The price for that, the cost for that, was, of course, that very much educational work in museums in the 70s and 80s and also in the 90s became directed towards the compulsory education system, and not so much adult education or lifelong learning. That came in the late 1990s and in the 21st century, where heritage institutions are considered places for learning in cultural policies in Scandinavia and the Baltics. And I think you will recognize this image is almost the same in all European countries. And as we have heard earlier today, we can make the package of learning or education in many, many different ways. And what we see in documents from the EU system, from role models as the UK, the GLO system. Well, these ways of communicating what learning and education is about is seen in almost all applications we see in Sweden, at least. For example, in Erasmus Plus and so forth, when organizations are applying for Erasmus Plus or Creative Europe and they're talking about learning, they're using this terminology. So that is of course a political move of the whole sector. But then we came to what I here will make the main point. When the museum directors or whoever answered our questions answered the question about the educational background of the pedagogical staff, we got this image. I don't know if you see it in the back, but I can explain what you see. The light blue is a university education, for example, in archaeology, art history, or something like that. The orange is a university education in archaeology or something like that, but also a course, at least, in education. In many countries, they have courses which are compulsory to take if you should work in upper secondary high school or something like that. It will typically be such a course. Then in the gray, we have a formal teacher education, primary or secondary teacher education. In the yellow, preschool teachers. And in the dark blue, other educational background. Well, what we can see from this is quite interesting. It is about 50% of the staff who are working with educational programs in museums have themselves educational formal training. That's quite interesting, I think. Because if we take another hat on and look at the museum system from the perspective of the educational world, which is huge. We are drops in the sea compared to the world of education. Think about it: preschool, compulsory school, upper secondary high school, universities, adult education system, etc., vocational training. It's huge. And they have professionals. And their professions, when they look upon us, they say, what are you doing? What's happening here? You're talking about education, learning. Do you know what you're talking about? That's my provocative question to you. Do we know what we're talking about? And because let's take the EU system as a model for this. When we read documents from the EU system, the General Director of Education and Culture, the educational part, they use a very classical terminology about education and learning. They're talking about formal, non-formal, and informal education, and that's that. There's no museum learning besides it. No. Learning and education is formal, non-formal, or informal. There's no fourth path. Forget it. If you talk about something besides that, nobody in the education system will understand what you're talking about. Nobody. You will get no respect in the educational world. And what we're doing, when we talk that I listened to the chair of NEMO this morning. You were saying that we are conducting or providing formal and informal education, etc., etc. I say, no, we are not. We are not. We are producing and we are offering informal education. Because informal education or informal learning, the characteristics of that is that there's no curriculum, you pass no exam, there's no diplomas, whereas non-formal is mostly known from vocational training. You get some sort of a diploma in the end. And the formal education, well, that is compulsory education system. And you can, when a teacher comes with his school, he or her school class to the museum, you do not take over the responsibility of what they're learning. It is still the teacher's responsibility. You cannot provide a diploma or pass exam or tick the boxes in curriculum. It is the teacher's job. You can be of service in this educational system, but no more. And if we continue to talk about our learning capacity and our educational purposes and our competences, etc., in an unprofessional way, we will never get the respect in the educational world. And as I said, when we talk to politicians about learning and education, who do you think they listen to? To the museum director, or to the dean of the university, or university college with teacher training? Who do you think? Of course. So I think it's worthwhile to think about what is actually happening here. And I think that if we should think positively about this, and we have to, and we should, of course, then we have to say that it is a question of communication. We have to use the same terminology. We have to talk to one another in a way so we understand and can respect one another and can use the strongest sides of what we can actually offer. And that is very, very important. And maybe we need somebody to help us with that. So what is very, 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 very positive is that all the museum directors almost said that we want our staff and we want ourselves to know more about theories of learning. We want to know more about what this world is talking about. That's very important. So that's a very good sign. So I think that some sort of a summary, I would say that museums are places of learning. Let's stick to that. But let us be aware what kind of learning we can provide and what we cannot provide, because we are not schools. That's very important. We will never, I don't think we want to become schools. My museum, at least not. And museums work with informal and non-formal learning, but connects to the formal learning system. And as you see, between 39% and 56% of our museum pedagogical staff have education within learning. On the other hand, about 50% have not. And there is, remember who owns the theories about, and the science and the politics on learning? We don't. It's another branch. And it is much, much bigger, much tougher, much richer, with much more influence than any of us. So I think we have to, when we talk about learning and education in the museum sector and provide what we can provide from the museum sector, we have to take into account that we have to communicate in a way which is understandable and can be respected. And it, of course, also is an issue for each museum who should provide learning opportunities. Who should do that? I'm not sure it has to be a teacher. No, because we're not a school. But it could be one of my museum people from archaeology or history or art history who gets some sort of a course or a few courses or several courses in pedagogical training. So this person can actually communicate with the compulsory education system when we provide for them. It is the same terminology which is used in adult education sector as in the formal education sector. It is exactly the same. But we have to get used to using a professional terminology. I think it is, well, let's put it like, it is counterproductive to invent our own terminology when we talk about learning. It's counterproductive. That's my message. Thank you.
Yeah, I need to thank Henrik very much for raising awareness about the language we have to use to make ourselves a pressure group, so to say, or to make us more conscious of the message that we are conveying, especially to funders. Because we want to stick to the time this afternoon, I would probably take not more than one, maximum 2 questions to Henrik.
Anja Schaluschke, German Museum Association. Thanks, Henrik. What would you think, does it help to work on the better communication between universities in the educational, that deal with education and educational questions and museum educators? The background of my question is that we actually have since 1 year or so a working group on education in our association that is led by 3 professors for education, and it is really a bit, yeah, it's really complicated because they seem so far away from what we are doing in the museums. Communication is not really working well in this working group, although we are glad that we have the input from these professors, but it's really hard.
Well, thank you for the question. It is absolutely relevant. How do we go from here to a better future? And I think there are several ways forward. One way forward is, of course, to say that our current pedagogical staff in museums should be provided training, pedagogical training, so they have they know the theories, they learn a few tricks, and they learn some methodology, and they get accustomed to using the correct terminology when they're talking about these issues. That's one thing. We have, and I think the museum associations are, of course, one way to do it, that you provide something like that, together with universities or whatever. The second way is, of course, Tine will say much more about it, is teacher training. There is another way into this. If teachers in their education learn how wonderful it is to use a museum as a classroom, that's another way to do it. So there are probably several ways forward in this, but what I think is the main point is that if we see ourselves as the educational and learning institution providing learning for everybody, then I think it is very important that when we talk about it and when we do it, we know what we're doing. And I'm not sure we do that.
Thank you. But a quick one, please.
Hi, Sandro De Bono from Malta, from Heritage Malta. I'm intrigued by your last statement on screen. I mean, remember who owns the theories, the science and politics on learning. Are you suggesting that we should be working on a theoretical framework for learning in museums?
No, absolutely not. No, it's a power struggle. We will lose it. Don't fight the teachers. They're very strong. It's a very strong community, and it's much, much bigger than us. Don't do that. I think it is much better to say, this is their profession. We should respect their profession as they respect our profession. We know about history, art, culture, etc., etc. We know about our artifacts, our collections. We know how to communicate with community, etc., etc. We have many competences which are very valuable. But there is a specific profession who knows everything about education and learning. It has been there for 200 years. They are very good at what they're doing. Well, forget the PISA reports, but they know what they're doing. And I think that if we should take a room in this learning community, then we have to adapt to their terminology and their framework, because they own these theories and the politics.
Okay, thank you very much, Henrik.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And because you introduced the next speaker so well, Tine Seligmann, could you please come in order to save time? I will not step up and down, and will save some energy in that way to just introduce our next speaker, who is the head of education at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Roskilde, Denmark. And she will speak of an important and interesting project, which, as Henrik said, brings together future teachers of primary school to introduce them into the world of museums, so that when they teach, they know that the museum is a resource they can use and they can count on. So, Tine, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Is it clear with the microphone? Yeah, fine. Yes, so today I will present the Learning Museum project. The first slide is on, which was a 3-year-long project running from 2011 to 2013. It was a national-wide project involving 30 museums and 13 colleges of education. Yeah. Yes, here student teachers were challenged to develop educational courses, tools, or methods for their coming pupils when visiting museums. And I have been asked to focus on the long-term implication on building a bridge between the museums and schools. And from my standpoint, the starting point is to empower and motivate the coming teacher, as the student teachers, to use the museums as a learning environment. But what could be the goals, the methods, and long-term implication of such a project? And my answer to that is sustainable learning partnerships. But what do make a sustainable partnership? Here there are many parameters, both economical, political, and organizational. But today I will use my time to focus on the relations, roles, and balances between the involved partners. And from my viewpoint, the first step to break down this critical barrier, and from my viewpoint, the first step is to break down some of the critical barriers which traditionally have held or hold many teachers from integrating museums into their teaching. So first, some of the objectives for the project was to make museums visible as an institution for knowledge and education for future teachers and their pupils, and also that the museums' education should be an integral element in the required curriculum for the teacher-students programs, and also, of course, that the collaboration with colleges of education should be integral in the museum strategy and educational programs. But one very important goal we had in the project was to work with the user involvement by incorporating the student teacher as a key resource person in museums' education departments and taking on their knowledge about pedagogic and didactic. And here, the first, having these objectives, I will have to question who is educating whom in such a context. And I hope in the end of my talk today, it will be clear how multidisciplinary collaboration and learning partnership can be a win-win situation for all partners in the long run. But first, have a look at the project. On the map, you can see all the project partners was spread all over Denmark. And so that we tried to gather both a historical art museum and a natural art museum around the colleges of education. And the project was combined by collaboration between the museums and the colleges of education, where we worked with the specialist modules, history, art, science, and art, etc. And here 1,826 students went through the programs in this period. And then we worked with the academic internships, where 42 were involved. And then the relationship to the student bachelor thesis. And here 16 wrote their thesis in the period. And then, of course, we had workshops and seminars between the whole group. So here we'll come with some examples from groups coming from the specialist module to make this as focused. So I will not talk about the academic internships or the bachelor thesis. And the first example here is from a cross-disciplinary visit at the open-air museum in the Danish town Odense. Here a group of teacher students came from the specialist module Religion and History, and they were charged with the assignment of producing a digital tool aimed to classes coming to museum on a self-guided visit. Always when the students come to the museums, the visits begin with an introduction to the museum as an educational institution and how museum plans its education for primary schools. But the focus will very quickly turn to the student work on their own, and they will typically get an assignment with practical and theoretical focus related to the collections or a historical period. And in some instances, the products will be so well developed that the museums will be able to incorporate them into the offerings after the basic school. And if you see on the quotations in this specific example, it's obvious that the student teachers are very happy to work on their own and to have responsible for their own learning outcome. They say it's super to get the assignments and that they are constantly using theory concepts and get them tested in practice at the museum. And they're also very happy not just to come to the museum and listen and look, but actually really use it when they're out there. And the photos you see is the students dressed up because they are about to make an application about the influence of the Danish folk high school they had on the peasant society. And this other slide shows another cross-disciplinary example where a group of student teachers from the specialist module mathematics visited an art and design museum. They got the assignment how to use the museum as an environment for primary school mathematics teaching. And also this visit over many times, of course not just 2 hours one afternoon, ended up in 3 new teaching tools that the museum could assist them when facilitating math at the museum. And also here, when you see the quotations, it's clear that all partners gain in this collaboration. The student teacher got the lesson to put theory into practice. The museum's educator would not have dreamt of having a math program if it hadn't been for the math students visiting the museum. And also the lecturer from the college got the possibility to make clear that what is possible when you work outside the classroom. So these practical assignments allow the students, teachers to be active, creative and innovative. And they say that it's very motivational to be collaborative partner to what you produce could be used in practice, and also that you can be challenged and be given responsibility, and not at least to be taken serious. And when we have evaluated the teaching courses and the students' products, it had been clear that one can speak of at least two ways in which the student teachers have learned to use the museum during this project. The student teachers have learned by using the museum, which means that student teachers learn something about their subject, art, history, geography, or mathematics, but also about other subjects as general didactic and citizenship. And the student teachers have learned to use the museum, and that means that the student teacher must know something about the museum as an institution, and they must know something about the museum as a space of learning. And also when the teaching takes place outside the classroom, the teacher has to rethink the planning, execution, and evaluation of their teaching. And finally, the student teacher learns something about collaborate with other professionals. And if you look at the pictures, it's obvious that the students in the different situations at the museums have had a very informal and creative approach to the collections in the museums, where they both have involved the senses and they have a very playful approach to substance and topics. And if you look at the next model here, it gets also clear when the museum's educator and the lecturer design teaching courses together for the students, and they want them to be active and self-producing. You can say that see on the materials produced by the student teachers, it shows that they adopt this design strategy and also creates sessions for their coming pupils where they do something similar and makes their pupils active and self-producing and responsible for their own learning outcome. So in this way, both the student teacher and their coming pupils have to demonstrate their understanding through production. And not finally, but nearly finally, this drawing shows how this kind of collaboration between colleges of education and museums has a wide interface when student teachers is put as a key person in the different processes in the project. In the drawing you can see that the student teacher is placed and have a new role in each of the different institutions. At the College of Education, the student is student of education. Then at the museum, it can either be academic intern at the museum, and then the student also can be at the school, where they also can be intern or a coming future teacher. In this way, the student teacher brings both the institution and the related individuals connected to the institution to each other. The lecturer from the College of Education gets in contact with the museum's educator, the museum's educator gets in contact with the school, and so forth. And also when you see in the triangles, the different teaching and didactic methods and practices also blends around in this system, which will lead to new innovative sets of values and roles for the involved partners. Okay, then I'm back to asking the question again, who is educating whom? Is it the museum's educator who is educating the student teacher, or is it the student teacher, the coming teacher, who is educating the museum's educator? And to give an answer to this, I have chosen a quote from Elisabeth Dosolos, which have had an article in the Journal of Museums Education, and she states, "A successful, meaningful collaboration between two different institutions is then largely about shared authority and acknowledgement of one another's skills, knowledge, and competences. These collaborative partnerships need constantly to question who is educating whom, so that both parties have the experience of being educators and learners simultaneously throughout the collaborative process." And second last slide here, I will also give the voice to one of the project participants, Ane, from the Workers' Museum in Copenhagen. She wrote an article, and here she stated, "It was only when we, by means of the Learning Museum concept, established closer collaboration with teacher educators on the planning and structuring of the workshops that the students' critical curiosity and questioning approach to the outside world and to their own future position as teachers lead us to rethink the format of the workshops. We had to depart from the asymmetrical us and them relationship and to meet in common reflections. Therefore, participatory workshops with real world problems and practical tasks to be solved within the exhibition became the concept behind the workshop we now hold, whether it's geography, general didactic, or history." And then the final slide, the Learning Museum project finished in 2013, but they're still working a lot with it, and all what we did, we collected all our findings, articles, interviews, practical guidelines how to work with both colleges of education, but also as an example of other institutions you will work with. So this has been a kind of concept we work with in Denmark now, not only in connection to the colleges of education, but also in other educational schools and institutions. I've brought some of these books today, and I've also brought some example of an article I wrote which goes deeper into the project, but this book can also be downloaded freely from the website you can see up on the here. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Tine, and there may be time for a question. I think it's a quite clear example of how a museum can work with the community, with the audience, with whoever. It just takes to have a look around and see who are the actors in your environment and establish connections and collaborations. Yes, Tamás.
I'm Tamás Vásárhelyi from Hungary. I would like to know who initiated this project and how did you convince the ministry to support it?
Yeah, actually it was my museum, and it was the concept I have had because during the 18 years I have worked at the museum, I have had many students visiting the museums, writing fantastic theses and papers about how to work with education, and they always come and ask me questions, so I have to rethink and think about what I'm doing when I'm working with education. So that was the starting point for making such. And then it's the culture of the Minister of Culture. We wrote an application and they said, go for it. Yeah.
I don't want to restrain the questions, but yeah, we'll take them. Okay, Chris. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Chris Storch from Rijeka 2020.
Now I can't see where you.
Here I am.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Hi. I just wondered how these impulses from the outside affected the staff and the way that the museum itself worked. That is, how much did you allow yourselves to be changed by these, let's say, outsiders producing something within and or, I'm sorry, in connection to the museum? How did the staff change?
In some ways positively, but I also, if I have been giving the question what could be the barriers in such a project, and that could be actually that museums sometimes are very afraid of letting other people coming in and telling them what to do, and also having new points. As you saw, the students were dancing and smelling and doing many different things you not normally want to do in the museum, and we often just want to do what we feel safe. And so, but there was many positive and also not so many negative in this project actually.
The very last one, very quick, please.
Hello. Hi, Janice Lane from National Museum Wales. It's really good to see a strategic approach to this kind of work. Is this project finished or is this going on? And is there any plans to do any longitudinal research in terms of the impact it has then on learning in the classroom or attainment or anything like that?
Yeah, actually Henrik and the NCK, they are working on getting it up on a political and more organizational level, because this is the basic and the praxis, experiments we have had over a period of 3 years. Okay, and I just have a final, I would recommend you all to read the latest Journal of Museums Education, where the theme is museums and schools working together, and when I just quickly went over the articles, I could see that the strategies were actually that students and pupils are both learners and educators. It was mentioned many times in this.
Which I think is a very, very important remark you made, yeah, and that we're taking home with us. Thank you very much, Tine. And I invite the next speaker to go on stage, Leszek Karczewski. And please, yes, I will introduce you while you take your place on stage. We're trying to speed up the process. Leszek is assistant professor at the University for Contemporary Culture at the University of Łódź and head of the education department of the Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź. And he will speak about Kulturanek, which is a TV program for children about contemporary art, which I was surprised to see is written, the TV program, and performed by museum educators. So museum educators playing yet another role, that of writing and performing a TV program. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Dear NEMO guests, as the head of the education department of Muzeum Sztuki, I'm really privileged and honored to be here. And I'm obliged also to give you a pinch of taste how Kulturanek looks. 38 episodes in total. So, but before I would like to travel back in time with you to the beginning of 19th century to give you a small background of special features of our museum. So please organize it. Is it possible to dim a light a bit, okay? And, in order to make our time travel possible. Because in the beginning, turn it off just, yeah, thank you very much. Much better. The contrast is better. In the beginning of 19th century, Łódź was, in fact, small hamlet inhabited by probably 100 people in the swamps in the very middle of Poland, partitioned by Prussia, Russia, and Austro-Hungarian Empire. And suddenly, during the Industrial Revolution, it occurred that this geographical feature creates a special possibility, creates a promised land for textile industry. In the 50 years, Łódź turned into $500 million town, industrial town, involved exclusively in processing cotton imported from Russia and re-exported as a ready-made textiles to the Russia again. So Łódź had a posh main street. This is a Piotrkowska street, about 1930, with all advantages of industrial revolution, like trams, electrified trams. But at the same time, it had no intellectual, cultural, artistic background, because imported, sorry for this word, imported forces of textile workers did not require any culture. There was one man who found this situation as a unique opportunity. It was Władysław Strzemiński, a Polish soldier who during the First World War lost one leg, one arm, and the sight in one eye, which completely crushed his martial career. He turned his interest and became an artist, an apprentice of Kazimierz Malewicz. You probably know Malewicz as a radical painter, but Malewicz was also a radical thinker in terms of extreme left-wing orientation. Malewicz proposed the institution of Museum for Artistic Culture, not cultivating the heritage of past ages, but rather witnessing the transformation from the feudal order into the new social one. And Władysław Strzemiński, as a pupil of Malewicz, transferred this idea of witnessing the contemporary mood, contemporary spirit into Poland when he arrived to Poland in the beginning of 20s when Poland regained independence after being partitioned. Strzemiński founded AR Group. AR is, of course, abbreviation. It means artistical revolution or revolutionary artists. Real avant-garde or revolutionary artist group. It consists only 5 individuals. Władysław Strzemiński, on the photo with his wife, Katarzyna Kobro, also the member of AR Group, theoretician and sculptors. Henrik Starzewski in the upper left corner, another painter, and 2 poets, Julian Przywoś and Jan Brzękowski. This group, because of the relationship with especially Parisian circles of abstraction création and Cercle Carré, collected 111 artworks from Picasso, Arp, Charchaume, Ernst, just to name a few, completely without any money. Just delivering the promise of opening public museum in Łódź, the town of textile workers. Muzeum Sztuki was really opened in the 1930 as the first in Poland, first in Europe, and second all over the world, museum devoted exclusively to the modern and contemporary art. In fact, the beginning was only 11 rooms within the town hall. This is the first well-known, probably, picture of international collection of modern art of AR Group. The point is that this rational, geometrical, abstract, constructivism, neoplasticism-oriented art is harsh to perceive, even. It's a harsh topic within the industrial city. So the whole museum was, from the very beginning, developed as an educational vehicle. From the very beginning, the first director of the Muzeum Sztuki, Marian Mnich, delivered lectures on the art history for textile workers as early as in the middle of 30s of 20th century. This is the last, I can say it that way, last branch of Muzeum Sztuki, MS Squared, within former high weaving mill of Poznański family cotton plant, with beautifully restored and rehabilitated as a site for presenting modern art. But we are still dealing with the same question as our founders: how to deal with this rational, intellectual, mathematical art. Moreover, this branch is located in the border of in the ultimate border, in the ultimate frontier of two words. First one is Disneyland, like capitalistic mall, Manufaktura. And the second is on the left, in this area view, dilapidated district of Stare Polesie. So the circled building of Muzeum Sztuki, MS Squared, is a site of a clash of two attitudes, completely different. I can share with you the observation that the public from the mall is probably more difficult than the public from the dilapidated district, because we in the museum have no sales. We've got only one collection, nothing new for spring and summer, nothing new for autumn and winter. So we are still dealing with two stereotypes, that this kind of art, this kind of unmimetical, undepictive art could be perceived properly and in decent way only by two individuals, by an artist who is, by definition, gifted, talented, and who has an ability in technical manner to produce works of art also, and by an artist, by an expert, an art historian, who has a vocabulary, who has an ability to to understand, comprehend this kind of art. Of course, these two are stereotypes, and we rejected them, of course, by two assumptions, two hypotheses. We turned the pedagogy, the art pedagogy, which can be defined as a trying to turn the individual into the professional artist, and to teach them how to draw, how to sculpt, how to make an installation, artistic video, by the pedagogy of creativity. I will discuss further. And we rejected the attitude stressing knowledge linked with their contemporary and modern art, with attitude stressing the interpretation. Everyone has the right to interpret the word. So the education model, the education format within the Kulturanek TV series is a participatory education for a personal and active reception of art by an emancipated viewer. Of course, I can refer to many theoreticians as ancient as Protagoras of Abdera, for example, then American pragmatism with John Dewey and Richard Schusterman as a pragmatism aesthetician. But I would like to refer only to one individual from the field of art. That's the Joseph Beuys with his equation, very famous, that everyone is not can became, is an artist. Because the Kunst ist Kapital, art is capital. But art is redefined by Beuys, not as a object for investments, but rather as a creativity, an ability to create something valuable, quite new, quite useful in very certain situation. And the second layer of attitude is the holistic model of the human being. Of course, you can refer to the pedagogy of Howard Gardner with his the theory of multiple intelligence. But I think that in education in total, in particular in museum, we overestimate sometimes the role of the reason in act of perceiving art, in act of interpreting art, okay? We've got knowledge, of course, but we have also emotions, and we have also body. For example, I'm as a speaker sweating, and I'm trembling, yeah? So this is an opening credit of our 38 episodes of Kulturanek, which was broadcasted publicly by the Polish national broadcaster TV Cultura, and multiple time re-aired, which is still available online in various platforms. Kulturanek is double-coded program. Direct auditory is, of course, children. But the second layer is that Kulturanek is a well-scripted, well-developed book of recipes for with workshops for children and the age of children spans from 7 to 13, I think. Let's see what means the bodily response. We can interpret in Kulturanek, for example, the Magdalena Abakanowicz work of art using no words, but only our bodies as a language of responding to art. And then participants can become performers, we can say, in public spaces, responding bodily to everyday objects, because it's a very strong stress in Kulturanek to translate the experience of art outside the museum, outside the gallery, into the everyday experience. Here we are dealing with the frottage technique of Max Ernst. We are doing paints from fruits and vegetables and stencils from fruits and vegetables too. Just to open the ghetto of modern art into the everyday experience, for example, in the kitchen. But what about dealing with a bit more highbrow topics? For example, dealing with an abstraction as a process. It's case study number 1. An elephant. It's strong. It's thick, yet powerful. It moves slowly. His hide is wrinkled and gray. Second step. This is an elephant. An elephant rose with blue circles. Tires are thick and wrinkled like an elephant hide. And the last step is an exhibition. It is an elephant? It is. I'm so glad I guessed, said the visitor. And what about the idea of using tires while referring to an elephant? Of using such an amount, large, heavy tires? Julia, because these tires, as they are set as a pile, show the shape of an elephant leg. The case number 2, sorry? Okay, sorry. We have 1 minute? Okay. Okay. Semiotic study on the nature of representation in 1 minute. Step 1. Children was asking to print a trace of selected parts of the body on a sheet of paper, and then to perform an action with a chosen trace as with a real body. But the third step was to reenact the same action with the real body. And let's listen to the summary. Do you agree it's just easier to perform with a sign? We can afford a lot contrary to the action with a real body or a real object. A sheet of paper is a sheet of paper, and a nose is a nose. Yeah? It's a pun improvised by the 7-year-old child, Emilia. Okay, thank you very much.
I'm sorry we had to cut this, but I'm sure that you can ask your questions during the coffee break to Leszek, who we saw was having a good time also, but we really want and have to finish at 3:15 because some people are then leaving. So I would invite the next speaker, Maria Vlachou, who will explore with us again some of the subjects that have been discussed this morning about education, community. Maria is head of, I don't remember your organization. I'm sorry.
Access Culture.
Access Culture. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. NEMO, thank you for the invitation. It is an honor to be here. Do you have them? Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. So allow me to start with a basic. What are museums about? Museums are about our heritage, our identity, our collective memory. They are about our past, present and future. They are places of knowledge, of encounter, of dialogue. They promote tolerance and respect. Museums have an educational role and they have a social role. And I'm sure we're all somehow familiar with these and that these are some of the reasons why we work in this field. Now, I would like to share with you some of the moments or incidents that made me question recently whether museums are living up to their mission and whether they are fulfilling their purpose. These two images were taken in July 2014. During the massacre in Gaza, there were demonstrations in a number of European cities against Israel, and the cry "Death to the Jews" was heard once again on European soil. On the window of a small Belgian cafe, a sign read, "Dogs are allowed, but Zionists under no circumstances." And it seems that the Turkish text read Jews, not Zionists. So I waited for our Jewish or Holocaust or Second World War or national history museums to react, to use all that material they have been collecting and preserving and researching in order to help people think a bit more critically about the situation. The only reaction that I'm aware of was a statement by the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington on rising anti-Semitism, and as it is usual and expected, there was no reference on that statement to the political and social context of the re-emergence of the phenomenon. A few months later, on 7 January 2015, two armed Islamists enter the offices of Charlie Hebdo, a satirical newspaper in Paris, killing 12 people, including 5 cartoonists. The world reacted to the barbarous attack on freedom of speech, and once again, I was curious to see how our museums would react, places of encounter, of tolerance, and of dialogue. One of the first museums that came to my attention that reacted was the Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Santiago de Chile. More museums of all kinds followed suit in a number of countries. In Portugal, the first museum to acknowledge the tragedy was the National Press Museum, which had Georges Wolinski, one of the murdered cartoonists, as a jury member in its annual cartoon contest. The next day, there was a reaction from the Bordalo Pinheiro Museum, Bordalo Pinheiro being a well-known Portuguese artist and cartoonist of the late 19th century. So these were somehow two obvious museums. It was normal, it was expected that they would react because of their subject matter. 3 or 4 more museums reacted in the days that followed. None of our big national museums had anything to say about this attack, although it mobilized people all over the world, including in Portugal. Then we arrive in June 2015, the climax of the so-called Greek crisis. There are many people composing our European Union. We travel freely from one country to the other. We take Erasmus courses. We are used to stereotypes. And we like to use them to fondly tease our friends and colleagues. But things got really tough last June. And frankly, I was taken aback by how easily citizens of all ages and from different European countries would adopt and perpetuate stereotypes on other people. So suddenly all Greeks are lazy and living at the expense of other Europeans, every German hides a Hitler in them, etc., etc. These were views based on headlines, on small talk. They were assumed without any further questioning. They were good enough truths. And for me, from one moment to the other, Europeans became cultureless. They became uncivilized. I was left wondering, where is our union? Where are our common values? Where are the things we learned from the past? Where is our critical thinking and our capacity to look for answers further from what shows on the surface? And where were our national museums? Keepers of our identity, of our collective memory, of our common values. As far as I know, they were nowhere. It is now November 2015. Last month, asylum seekers and refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, at least the ones who survived crossing the Aegean Sea, were denied entry in Hungary, and they were treated with unbelievable brutality. And at the time these things were happening, no national European museum thought it appropriate, urgent even, to remind us of the stories of the Greeks in 1922, or of the Hungarians themselves in 1956, or the Bosnians in 1995. Europe is full of stories of refugees. Actually, at the time all this is happening, museums all around Europe were celebrating European Heritage Days, and the official theme was industrial and technical heritage. I came across one exception. In Greece, the official theme was violence and tolerance, diversity in Europe, and I don't know what caused this deviation, but in general, and once again, I felt that museums were somehow cut off from the reality around them. Just very recently, last week, I realized that the Archaeological Museum of Chalkida in Greece was involved in the collection of clothes for the refugees. And I decided to mention this in this presentation because it was for me a kind of hope. And it became a stronger hope when I found out about Alexandra's work in Slovenia today. So there are more museums acknowledging at least the situation. This was organized by the Association of Greek Archaeologists, and the general title is People and Monuments in Danger. Not just monuments, people and monuments in danger. So I would like to go back to my initial question, what are museums about, for which we normally have some immediate and obvious answers. Museums collect, preserve, research, exhibit, and interpret. But let's ask ourselves again, what for? I don't see museums as islands, and I cannot conceive cultural institutions that remain untouched by what's going on around them. We don't collect for the sake of objects alone. We collect because we can produce knowledge that can help us understand the past, reflect on our present, and dream of our future. And we don't produce knowledge for the sake of knowledge alone as a mere intellectual exercise among the specialists in each field. We produce knowledge so that each and every one of us can grow as a person, can become more critical of our society and more involved, can learn to appreciate dialogue, feel empathy, be tolerant, become more educated and more civilized, less barbarian, at all times and in all places recognize the humanity of others fully. So I feel we are failing. We are failing every time we don't put our work into real use at the service of society. We're failing every time we choose to remain silent in the name of some fictitious neutrality. Silence is a political option, and what we do is anything but neutral. Museums and cultural organizations in general are part of this society. They cannot choose to stay apart. They are part of a network together with other social and educational institutions which aims to improve our society by supporting freedom, justice, and the equality of all human beings. A year ago, our colleagues in the United States of America were confronted with these issues following the killings of black people by the police in different US cities and the decisions of grand juries not to charge the policemen involved. In a joint statement from museum bloggers and professionals, we read, "Things must change. New laws and policies will help. but any movement toward greater cultural and racial understanding and communication must be supported by our country's cultural and educational infrastructure. Museums are a part of this educational and cultural network. And further down, as of now, only the Association of African American Museums has issued a formal statement about the larger issues related to Ferguson, Cleveland, and Staten Island. We believe that the silence of other museum organizations sends a message that these issues are the concern only of African Americans and only of African American museums. We know that this is not the case. So this is something I believe we should all consider, our connection to contemporary social issues, no matter what kind of collection we have. When 5 cartoonists are murdered in Paris because of the work they do, and we may or may not appreciate that work, that's not the issue here, I don't expect only the 2 Portuguese museums who are related to the art of political cartoon to take a stand. I expect every Portuguese museum that assumes an educational role in the promotion of tolerance, dialogue, and respect to take a stand. And there are different ways of assuming our educational role and taking a stand, hopefully not only in the aftermath of a tragedy. In 2014, the exhibition 140 Characters at the São Paulo Museum of Modern Art in Brazil had brought together 140 works from the museum collection, inviting people to reflect on the social unrest that Brazil was experiencing at the time and the political mobilization through the social media, 140 being the maximum number of characters we can use on a single tweet on Twitter. In that same year, we had Disobedient Objects at the Victoria and Albert Museum, an exhibition that brought together examples of art and design which were developed by countercultures to communicate political messages and to facilitate protests. And as one of the curators, Gavin Grindon, explained at the time, social movement cultures aren't normally collected by museums, with the exception of prints and posters. We wanted to raise the question of this absence of other kinds of disobedient objects in the museum. The approach here was different from the one at the São Paulo Museum. Here, a gap was identified in the collection, and the aim was to fill this gap as well as to maintain the museum relevant. It was the year before, 2013, that the Victoria and Albert presented its rapid response collecting strategy, which determined that objects would be collected in response to major moments in history, and in the case of the V&A, this touches the world of design and manufacturing. So, our objects and the stories they carry can help us reflect on our contemporary life. We can and should do this, not with an opportunistic intent, but as part of a larger strategy that puts our work at the service of society and keeps it relevant, by fully and permanently assuming our role in educating active and critical citizens. As Martin Luther King said, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. Museums are not just buildings full of objects. Museums are the people, you and me, the men and women working in them, running them, and making decisions. We are not living in a world apart, both as individuals and as professionals. And we should do our best to be part of people's lives, to be relevant to them. These are indeed times of challenge and controversy for Europe and beyond, and I wish to see more museums living up to this challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. And I apologize both to Leszek and to Maria for not taking questions now. They will be taken at the end of the session, so in about 10-15 minutes, so please. I'm sure you will not forget them, and we have some time still at the end. So I'm inviting our last speaker, Michel Magnier, to come to the podium. Michel is a representative of the European Union in this context as head of culture and creativity. Before that, he covered many prestigious positions in the French public administration. He will speak to us about education, culture, and what we should expect from European programs, or how the Union sees the connection between museums, education, and so I'm sure that this will be an interesting and inspiring presentation for us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's quite a challenge for me to speak immediately after what we just heard, which I think was very powerful and inspiring, and I will probably go down a couple of levels. I'm sorry for that. Let me first thank the organizers for inviting me, even though actually they didn't invite me. I invited myself when I had the opportunity of doing it in a very nice meeting with a bunch of Scandinavian Nordic people. They are here, including Henrik, Niels, a couple of months ago in Brussels. And I said, well, I'd like to go back to NEMO, because I have very good memories of my visit in Bologna last year. I'm not speaking as an expert. As we just heard, my only field of expertise is my own experience, and I will share it with you. It's basically an experience from the European Union institutions. Since last year, I tried to do my homework, and I visited a lot of museums. This is a list if you're interested. Actually, I realized that I like going to museums, not so much for the collections, sometimes they're even a nuisance, but because the museum itself is an interesting topic. It's an interesting thing to see, the building, the monument, the architecture, the way the collections are organized, whether they manage to have a connection with the audience, me, or whether I get bored after a couple of minutes. I mean, it's really interesting. So somebody told me yesterday that it's professional deformation. I'm not a professional, but still, I mean, I'm getting some inspiration for you. So my objective in life now is to visit as many museums as I can, and it's a challenging mission because according to ICOM, the number of museums has increased in 20 years from 23,000 to 55,000. So there would be 55,000 museums in the world. So quite a challenge for me. I think this year you've picked an excellent topic, as we've seen since the beginning of this conference, educational value of museums and connection to audiences. Just like social cohesion, which you chose last year, if you remember, that was the topic of your conference in 2014. Education, I think, is very high on the current European priorities. It may not be so visible, but there are signals everywhere that it is taken increasingly for a priority. As you know, we have a completely new European context since we met last year. We have a new commission. We have a new work plan for culture, which is our strategy, which we implement with the member states, which was adopted last year, just after the Bologna conference. And we've had a lot of activity in the field of heritage policy, as you probably know. But so far, what I realized is that there has been little focus on museums. We support NEMO, as you know. You are one of the networks getting a subsidy from Creative Europe. We're very pleased to support you. But I must confess that we don't have a clear vision of how this should translate into policy action. So the question for me is how we can use the potential of museums to contribute to the current EU strategy. And I will address two issues. One is the educational value of museums, seen from my perspective, of course, and the second is the topic of audience development. Just to start, I found an interesting statement from one of the leading museum directors in Montreal, in Canada. She's both French and Canadian, so she has a dual background. And this echoes the question asked by Maria, whether the museums are failing. This one is in French, but I had a free translation provided by Google, which I had to correct a bit. English speakers may find it questionable, but basically he says that a museum must change if he wants to remain relevant. It's no longer about preserving, conserving, it's about sharing, being connected to the reality and to the future. I think it's an interesting statement. I prepared it, but you said that before, so it's just a repetition. Now, My first topic is educational value of museums. It's very clear for almost everybody in the room that education is part of the museum's mission. It's in the definition from ICOM, and Henrik reminded us that in Scandinavia it's even the most important purpose of a museum. But I must say from my non-expert perspective that it's a bit counterintuitive. I'm not sure that everybody will agree that a museum is about education in the first place. The scope is very broad for this educational role. It's, of course, kids, young people, but it's everybody, basically, through lifelong learning. I tried to find some inspiration in NEMO's contributions, which are, as you know, numerous. And I found a study which was funded by Creative Europe, so we're partly responsible for it, which is called Learning in Museums and Young People. And I found some interesting statements about learning in museums. This is one of them. It basically says that there's a complement to schools and the formal education system, keeping in mind the very useful warning given by Henrik in his presentation that these two words should cooperate rather than fight each other. The question, of course, is how can we implement these very sound principles? Again, I watched your website, NEMO's website, and I found very interesting examples in the publication Values for Museums. But this is not a policy yet. It's just best practices. It's very important, but the question is to translate that again in a policy. Every time you ask this kind of question nowadays, you get the same reply: digitization. Digital has become the miracle cure. Every time you have a problem, let's go digital and you solve the problem. And actually, your study mentions digital tools. It mentions websites, social networks, digitization of collections, more interactive exhibits, etc. To be honest, if I may venture to propose a personal opinion there, I'm starting to have doubts about digital. I'm really wondering whether mere digitization actually brings added value. I'm really wondering whether people really want to see the reality on the screens or their iPads or iPhones all the time. I'm really wondering whether a website or a Facebook page can bring more young people to museums so that they can actively learn. I'm really wondering. I mean, I'm asking a question. I'm waiting for your replies. I would make a reference to opera. Opera, which is one of my favorite artistic practice. I'm not a singer, I'm not a musician, I'm just an opera goer. We funded a superb project called the Opera Platform. I don't know if you know it. It's a platform which enables everybody through the internet to watch the best opera performances everywhere in the world. I tried to use that, but I couldn't go beyond 1 hour because after a while I had the impression that it was not opera, it was something else, it was different. Watching an opera on my iPad is not extremely exciting for me, and I know many people who share this feeling. My personal opinion about digital museum, which is a concept many people refer to, is that maybe it's an illusion. What makes a museum, from my experience, is the contact with reality, the confrontation between the visitor and the works which are exhibited. So there's a lesson we are drawing at the moment from our work on the digital world. This lesson is that the analog world plus the information communication technology do not equate digital world. The digital world is something else. Is something new, actually. So how can we use digital tools for educational purposes? The Commission produced a report a couple of years ago which was called Opening Up Education, which was about that, about how new digital tools could help innovate in the field of teaching and learning. And there were two main aspects. One was the use of modern education tools, e-learning, massive online open courses, digital textbooks, exercise software, serious games, etc., etc. And the other one was better ICT connectivity for schools and universities, because apparently 60% of our 9-year-olds don't have access to this kind of equipment in the EU. So this document, Opening Up Education, contains some language, some orientations for using the digital revolution at the benefit of education. You can see a couple of sentences which I extracted, one of them being interesting, that all individuals can learn anywhere, anytime, through any device with the support of anyone. The miracle cure. The question I want to ask on this topic is, how can we help? How can you help to make it happen? We have a program to support culture and cultural and creative industry that's called Kreativní Evropa in the Czech language. You can see the totem we have put at the end of this room. And among the priorities we have for Creative Europe, one of them is education and training. And before I came here, I carried out a check in our database to see how many projects we are funding or we have funded about museums and educations. And unfortunately, I couldn't find a lot. I couldn't find any, to be honest. So I think there's an unprospective field of action there. Creative Europe is an innovative program, wants to be an innovative program, and this field is a bit underdeveloped. It's counterintuitive because, as I said, there are plenty of excellent initiatives which probably would deserve support from the European Union. So my message there is that there's a scope for further action, and I would call for NEMO to trigger, to support innovative projects to be submitted to Creative Europe in the future, because obviously this is something we can do and this is something we should do. What a sense of purpose there. My second point today is audience development. Audience development is clearly a priority of our cultural policy. It goes beyond education and learning. It's directed towards the audiences. If you look at the three main criteria for assessing projects in Creative Europe, yes, sorry. You can see that the second one is audience development. We have a definition which I want to share with you today because it's new. Audience development is a strategic, dynamic, and interactive process of making the arts and culture widely accessible. So it's about three things. It's about increasing audiences. It's about bringing new audiences with the same profile as the one who are the current audience. Secondly, it's about deepening the relationship with the audiences. So it's going further, it's going deeper with the existing audiences so that we get more loyalty and return in exchange of this action. And thirdly, and most importantly for me, it's about diversifying audiences. So attracting new people with a different profile and background than the current audiences, including those people who don't have contacts with the arts and culture. Audience development, as I said, is a basic principle for the work plan for culture, the strategy we implement with the member states, and it's in the legal base of the Creative Europe program. Sorry, I'm a bit lost with my slides. Yeah, here. Well, okay. With the member states, we have a working method which is very flexible and which is called the open method of coordination. So we can't produce legislation. I think I told that last year. It's not an area where it's acceptable by member states. So we coordinate, we try to facilitate, and we use a method which is called the open method of coordination. We produced recently some reports which are relevant for audience development. You have the list on the screen behind me. One of them is going on, and it's called access to culture via digital means. This is a way for us to learn a bit more about how digital means can contribute to our objectives. And it's an echo to what I just said, that I had my doubts about the digital world. This is something NEMO could possibly contribute to, helping us to identify the best way of promoting access to culture via digital means. So audience development is, as I said, a criterion for selection of projects. We use it in two different strands of Creative Europe. One is the network strand. This is the strand which enabled us to support NEMO. And the second one, which is the most important, is the cooperation projects. It's one of the key criteria. So audience development is not just a buzzword. It's something which is really meaningful, and the meaning is basically twofold. The first meaning is that the demand side is given as much importance as the supply side, and this is a major change in our policies. And the second meaning is that we encourage a trend towards a more audience-centric organization. Not an organization which is self-centered, but an organization which is centered towards the audience. And from what I heard today, I mean, it's very relevant for museums. Let me tell you about two actions which maybe are worth mentioning to illustrate a bit more my talk. The first is a project called MELA. MELA has a meaning, but I forgot about it. It means something in a language which may be Sanskrit, a very old language. It means gathering, I think, or something like that. It's a research project funded by the Commission in 2011, which just finished. It's a big project led by the Politecnico di Milano. The idea is to reinvent the role of museums in the 21st century and identify innovative practices. I'm not sure you all know about this project, MELA. Who knows about it? Okay, fine. One of the recommendations, which is relevant for audience development, says that museums should endorse experimentation with innovative ways of engaging with wider audiences. So it's a recommendation. Again, the question of the how is for you. The question of the what has been tackled by the study. I have my doubts, honestly, whether this is directly usable by museums, but at least you have a theoretical starting point, and this has the merit of existing. Perhaps on a more operational level, we are very soon launching a study on audience development. This is a smaller action. This will be funded by Creative Europe. The objectives are, first, to identify successful approaches and disseminate them in the field of audience development, and the second, to further refine the criteria we use for funding projects under Creative Europe. And this is a part which is probably the more operational. We want at the end to create a catalogue of best practices. The keywords here are probably very familiar to you. It's social responsibility, participation, interdisciplinarity, co-creation, cultural welfare, etc. The methodology will be to engage with all relevant stakeholders, and NEMO has been specifically mentioned in the call for proposals. So you will be expected to comment and to contribute to this study. So that was it. Conclusion. Again, I think the most important thing I heard this morning and today actually is that audience must really be at the heart of all cultural policies. That's very clear. Museums and libraries, but mostly museums, have the potential of being the most inclusive cultural operators and organizations, I'm sure. Museums are actually agora, where people meet, where people talk to each other. They're fora, where people can express their views. To put it in a more complex and technocratic way, I'm just quoting MELA, again, the report. It says that museums are sites of contaminations, fluxes, border crossings, and migrating memories. Okay, let's put it more simply. I really share NEMO's vision that museums can change lives. I mean, this is a very strong statement, but I'm sure it's true. And as Kallio said this morning, they can make the world better. So let's hope it will happen. And I'm completely lost with my slides, but the final one is about two things. We have a Creative Europe Facebook page with 25,000 likes. If you want to like us, we're always pleased to be liked. And in 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time actually, there will be in Brussels the biannual, so every 2 years, Culture Forum, which is an important event, and I know that some people from NEMO will be there and participate, so we expect this event to be a success as well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, and I don't know if you have to leave immediately, Michelle, or you can stay. I would invite for 5-10 minutes the other two speakers, Maria and Leszek, to come back. So if there are questions, and if you agree, I hope you agree, we might slightly shorten our coffee break to get the questions that we didn't get before. Or comments. Yes.
Hello, Chris Torch again from Rijeka 2020. Michelle, thank you very much for a really clear presentation of this, how action transforms into policy and how policy can return and generate action. I only have one comment. I think that this idea about developing audiences, which is essential in the way that you described it, for existing art forms and arenas might actually also, though, at the same time be delaying the necessary process of change when it comes to production. Production, participation. These things often get kind of put aside. That is, what we're trying to do is remedy what seems to be a gap of confidence between citizens and the museums, the institutions that they're paying for. And that somehow it's we that have to change as well. And that this self-reflection, I mean, it's not your job to come here from the Commission and tell the museums how they must change. But NEMO and all of us who are working with museums have to consider also that it's the product that we present and the process that we make which will determine this new, as you call, diversified and shifting audiences. And I just want to remind that I think it's not just about selling old cars to new people. It's about, in fact, really reinventing the car, or in fact changing it and leaving the car and going straight on into the public space. And I thank both of you for also your presentations as well in the same way. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brian Crowley from the Irish Museums Association. My question is for Maria, because when I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about the fact that, like a lot of people, I read kind of vaguely liberal, left-leaning newspapers, and often you're reading things in The Guardian and whatever, and you think exactly the people who should be reading this article, who need to be maybe educated or see another side to many of the issues around things like immigration, aren't going to read this because years ago they've dismissed this newspaper as being liberal and left-leaning. And I think in terms of museums, I suppose one of our great assets is the fact that we are a public space that's open to all, where I suppose all are welcome. And I just wonder, is public statements always the best way to go? Or does our real strength lie in terms of programming and exhibitions? Because I think, particularly if you look at the United States, there's a whole swathe of the population who have dismissed, even to us, what seems very kind of centrist media as being, part of a wider agenda. And is there a danger that obviously it's kind of very almost tempting to make these grand statements, but it's very easy then that if you make these, that you become dismissed, or you're seen as taking a stand can be seen as taking a side. And do we need to be a little bit more subtle and a little bit more clever in terms of how we promote those very important values of humanity and tolerance?
Thank you for your question, great question, and that's what's most tricky, I believe, about the way I think about these things. This was more or less what we were discussing at lunchtime. We can work around the issues as long as we don't think we're being neutral, because we're not. Even in exhibitions, we say a story, there is a narrative, and we choose what we're going to present, so there's nothing neutral about it. There's always a decision to say something, to leave something else outside. What I believe museums can really be are spaces where people can meet each other. At lunchtime, we were saying my son came back from school the other day very disturbed because another child told him that all refugees should be sent back because they are here to take our money. And because he listens more to my views, he was shocked by this confrontation. And school is one place where this kind of confrontation can happen and be moderated in the sense of somebody promoting this dialogue, for these things to be heard, and for everybody to understand that we don't see things the same way. And another great place for these things to happen are museums. And I believe that my son will have a completely different or new or richer idea about what it means to be a refugee once he meets a refugee child. And once the stories get a face, someone's face. It's not something abstract. And museums are a great place for that to happen. Even if we present a story, we can say, well, that's the way we see things, that's what we know today, because history is not something that, okay, it's said and it's finished. And we can invite people to come and talk about it and bring other views in it. So the museum doesn't close the doors, it opens them to dialogue.
If you allow me, thank you very much. I have a very last question to Leszek, because I'm sorry I cut your presentation, and I would like to know how the story ended, whether you had a final message, or also, well, it's perfectly reasonable that I have this curiosity, and especially if your program made also other people, not necessarily only children, interested in contemporary art.
Well, it's a bit unmeasurable. We didn't have a survey among the public on the auditory of the Kulturanek. Well, I think this this kind of double-coded utterance for children and for their parents or the teachers is the best way to communicate with as wide audience as it possible. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. 1 second, and then we close. Really. Sorry. It's going to be a second. I run to you. Okay.
I just wanted to say. To what gentleman, I didn't see who it was, asked before. First of all, I'm happy to have met you because you're full of great ideas and thinking. I just wanted to say, in this day of media, people do not believe the television, the newspaper, they do not believe internet, they do not believe in anything anymore. But museum, when people come to the museum, they believe us. And if we are going to be silent, then who else is there to speak the truth? Thank you.
Yeah. Martina Lemanová, ICOM Czech, and very last thing I really would like to add, the space of museums is the very democratical space. If you want to, you can go there. If you don't want to, you don't go there. And it is the biggest advantage, and it's the same with the learning. You have to go to grammar school, and you know that you will learn there certain things. But if you are going to a museum, you can decide what you would like to learn. And in the connections with this problem of refugees, museums are also very important, because these are the most important places which are showing us our history, the specific things about our region, about the place where the people are behaving or are living now in these days, and they can learn about the country and they can get know it. So it can also help in the process of integration. So thank you.
Very good. I would like to thank all the speakers and the audience for being so passionate, but because you were so passionate and we took too much time, we're shortening the coffee break to 15 minutes, so we are back at 3:45. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please.